Welcome to the McCarthy Report, the podcast where I, Rich Lowry, discuss with Andy McCarthy the latest legal and national security issues. This week, what else? The latest on the Mar-a-Lago search. You are, of course, listening to a National Review podcast. For some reason, you're not already following us on streaming service. You can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. And please give this podcast an Andy McCarthy, the glowing, indeed gushing 5-star reviews they deserve on iTunes. And now, without further ado, I welcome to this very podcast through the miracle of Zoom, none other than Andy McCarthy.
Rich, how are you?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
I'm good. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed today. There's a lot. There's a lot, and there's a lot of legal stuff. And it's usually I like it when we're busy, but sometimes I just get the feeling like there's like a limited amount of bandwidth and just like too much coming at us.
But your bandwidth is limitless. Don't
yeah, right.
None of this false modesty.
I'm feeling it. I have to tell you.
So we'll do Mar-a-Lago first, and then it's our intention to get to the student loan, the debt forgiveness, and the bar memo. But let's dig in on Mar-a-Lago. We're recording a little earlier than usual on Thursday instead of Friday. So Thursday morning here, the affidavit is supposed to be released sometime today. So we're going to be dated on that particular question. But let's just go to the general arc of our understanding of this story. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Andy, but you, my take on where you are is you're scooching over to the position. Well, it looks like this raid, search, was justified or at least not unreasonable based on what we're learning, including perhaps most importantly, this letter from the archivist or someone at the National Archives to Trump's lawyer about this matter that detailed just the back and forth and just how extensive the negotiation was here and how recalcitrant Trump was just to give in and cooperate. But let's go big picture. Where are you? And then we'll dig in on various threads.
Well, I'm pleased to inform you, Rich, because I almost fell out of my chair this morning, but the Washington Post used the word raid in describing the search. So I think you're safe. I think apparently raid is back in. It was out of fashion for a couple of days when I guess the left thought it was too aggressive in describing what Biden was up to. But now that they're back on the side of the angels, Trump deserves to have been raided. So it's a raid again.
Well, it's just one of these unavoidable terms. It's sort of become a formal noun, capital raid, capital R raid might not be the technically correct term for what it is, but what it's known as.
Yeah. So here's where I think you're generally accurately describing where I am. And the reason I'm there is just simply, I think that people on my side of this who have questioned whether it was really necessary under these circumstances to do a search warrant, I still want to hear why there weren't other alternatives that they could have turned to. On the other hand, most of the alternatives now that people are talking about are pretty aggressive in and of themselves. Like, our friends David Rivkin and Lee Casey wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago where they argued I unfortunately disagree with their legal analysis, but one of their points is that they should the same point I've been making. The search warrant was over the top. They didn't need to do a search warrant. But then when you ask, okay, well, what's your alternative? They talk about you get a restraining order where a court, what they were talking about is pretty aggressive, and my thing is, I don't want to get so dug into a position that if the facts change, I'm too stubborn to change with them. And I don't want to say there's some other aggressive thing that they could have done that I can concoct just because I don't want to say the search warrant was okay. So I think we're getting to the point where at a minimum, the people who think the search was over the top have to confront the question, well, what alternative? And I think the best criticism you can make of the people who are on the other side of it is that even if there were other alternatives besides the search warrant, that doesn't mean doing the search was unreasonable on these circumstances. It's certainly, the more facts we know, the less unreasonable it seems, because when you get down to it, they did do enough here that you can finally put the question, if they didn't do a search warrant, how were they ever going to get this information back that's the property of the government? Now, on the other hand, I still think it's fair to argue that, number one, the Presidential Records Act is not a criminal statute, and Congress didn't intend for this to be enforced by criminal law measures. But that really only covers the non-classified documents. The classified documents are a big problem. And I think, we can argue. I actually sent Jim a little note this morning because I found some authority that I think supports the argument that he made that Trump has to do something besides, wave a wand or imagine declassification into existence. I was kind of open to the idea that since that hasn't been litigated, we don't know what a president has to do to declassify something. But when I was doing some research into the Presidential Records Act, there's a provision of the Presidential Records Act that flatly says that presidents have the obligation to document the activities of their presidency. It says right there that the president shall take all such steps as may be necessary to assure that the activities of the presidency are adequately documented and that such records are preserved and maintained. So, I think that's additional grist for the argument that he had to do something official and in writing to declassify things. But let's say that's wrong. Let's say that, the position I speculated on last week, that we don't know because this has never been litigated before. And we don't know, by the way, Trump's argument in a case, if a case ever came up, would be, no matter what Congress said in that statute, this is my plenary authority under Article 2 of the Constitution. Congress can't regulate it. So I think as I said in the note I sent to Jim this morning, I think there's at least 6 and maybe 8 or 9 votes on the Supreme Court against that position. I think they would take the position that Congress can make, reasonable regulations in this area. But let's say it's wrong. Let's say, Trump is absolutely right. All he needs to do is imagine things into a declassified status. That wouldn't change the fact that sensitive national security secrets at the highest level of classification in the United States were down at Mar-a-Lago. And his capacity, if he had it personally, to declassify these documents means that a criminal prosecution of him would be difficult. But it doesn't change the national security problem for the country of these documents being down there. Him waving a wand and saying this is hereby declassified doesn't make that information any less explosive for the country if it falls into the wrong hands. So because it would be that would be a bad declassification, or even if it's technically declassified, it doesn't make the documents less inherently sensitive. Right. Exactly. That's the point. I mean, I think you have to look at this. And Rich, I feel like this is like the same. I feel like for 25 or 30 years, it's the same issue every time, which is this tension between the criminal law and national security, and why you never want to make the criminal law your go-to toolbox for national security problems. Because whether or not there's a criminal case against Trump, let's say there's a document in Mar-a-Lago that they've been mishandling, it's obviously not in a place where it's supposed to be, but they have it laying out on a coffee table or something. And it turns out that it's that thing you described, was it last week or the week before when we were talking about it, a list that has some of our most sensitive informants on it, who, if they were known by the Chinese or the Russians or whoever, could be killed, or a terrorist organization, right? The fact that you couldn't prosecute Trump for unlawful possession of classified information because he personally was in a position to declassify it, and even if you say I wave a wand and it's declassified, that legally is sufficient, that wouldn't change the fact that it would be amazingly, tremendously, catastrophically damaging for the country if that document fell into the wrong hands. So it just seems to me that the national security threat to the country is a question totally separate from whether there's sufficient evidence to make a criminal case on a person, and in this case, the person being Trump. So I just think that we need to be fairer to the people who have to make these hard calls, because this is a hard call. If you know that information is down there, the government's got to figure out a way to get the information, whether or not they have a criminal case on Trump. And I have to say, if I were in the government and we were sitting around talking about, well, what do we do here? I would say, look, if I have a plausible legal basis to get in there, and I can grab the stuff that would help the national security of the country for it to be back in our possession, I would sign off on that in a heartbeat. And I wouldn't feel like I was doing anything wrong just because I had an alternative reason besides the reason I put in a search warrant. What you can't do is you can't lie in the warrant, right? You can't make up a crime that hasn't happened. But if you have a legal basis to go in, and going in is helpful for other reasons, that's not a reason not to go in, just because they're not the reasons that you would put in the warrant. So I just think that I'm still very uncomfortable with the idea that you do a search warrant on the home of a former president. I think, especially the way our politics are now and how weaponized they've become, and the way that people are they watch what the Justice Department does in a lot of these cases, where they're, sending the FBI out to grill parents about protesting in the schools and all the stuff they do that's over the top. There are people on the Republican side, and especially the pro-Trump side, who are just licking their chops for when we get back in there again, to show these other guys, what goes around comes around, and you want to have this kind of Justice Department, then we can give you that kind of Justice Department. I hate that. So anyway.
So let's go some more on this letter. So it was reported by John Solomon of Just News, friend of ours, very anti FBI and Justice Department. And what he was highlighting from the letter was it showed that Joe Biden was involved because he had to approve or at least supposedly give the archivist the authority to make a decision regarding executive privilege. So what has Biden said to this point about his involvement, and what does this letter show us?
Yeah. So, Biden has a constitutionally illiterate notion about the Justice Department. I don't know if he really believes it, but he says it because, his side purports to believe it, that there should be no political interference whatsoever, ever in the Justice Department. And therefore, the White House is completely separate from the Justice Department. They never get involved in anything the Justice Department is doing. The Justice Department is like off by itself as a fourth branch of government, and we don't interfere with them because that would be political interference in law enforcement, and we don't do that. So, constitutionally, the Justice Department, there's only one executive official who has power in the government. I feel like we say this every week, but the president is the head of the executive branch. The Justice Department is in the executive branch and answers to the president. And no, we don't want political interference in the day-to-day enforcement of the law. We don't want politics deciding who gets investigated. But there's a lot of good reason for the president to get involved in the Justice Department, not least the fact that, like, for example, I would assume that the next Republican president is going to run like Nixon did and like Reagan did on cracking down on crime. Well, if you're not going to get involved in the Justice Department, it's going to be awfully hard to crack down on crime. So, of course, in terms of setting the policy agenda for the Justice Department, the president is obviously very important. And the Justice Department answers to the president. So I just think Biden's theatrical, moronic thing that, oh, no, we can never interfere with the Justice Department under no circumstances is just stupid. But that's his story and he's sticking to it. And as a result, he has some, he's got some embarrassment here that he's going to have to deal with. Now, to be fair to Biden, the part of the story that John Solomon didn't report is the part that you just described, which is the fact that Biden had to get involved here. It wasn't that Biden chose to get involved. Biden had to get involved statutorily, and I'll get into why. And, you know, to be fair to Biden, he knows that anything he does that has any connection whatsoever to an investigation of Trump is going to be framed by Trump politically as weaponizing the Justice Department against his likely opponent in the 2024 election. So even if he has by law to have to get involved in these things, he doesn't want to appear to be involved because it's got a political cost for him that he doesn't want to bear. So here's what happened, Rich. The FBI, well, after a lot of back and forth in late 2021, essentially when the archivist finally threw up his hands, there's a lot of reporting today, by the way, that this all began in around May of 2021. There was a letter. The New York Times and the Washington Post both report today that there was a letter or an email that went from the National Archives and Records Administration, that's NARA, the general counsel there, to two of Trump's representatives with the National Archives. Every president has to designate representatives who deal with the National Archives on his behalf. And also Pat Philbin, who had been one of Trump's White House counsel. He was the deputy to Pat Cipollone at the White House counsel's office. So NARA is writing to the Trump people as early as May 6th, saying there's 24 boxes missing. We knew, like, right off the bat, the letters from Kim Jong, the correspondence between Trump and Kim Jong-un, including the original letters, and Obama's letter that he left for Trump, as presidents traditionally do when there's a transition from one to the next, they were both missing. So that immediately came to the attention of the archivists. And then they went, more deliberately through stuff, and they realized that there's 24 boxes of stuff that are missing, and that Trump was notorious for bringing stuff from the White House, from the Oval Office up to the residence, to read, and he hoarded a lot of stuff up there. And what the archivist says is, at a certain point in time, when they raised this in the autumn of 2021, when it was, it was becoming clear that Trump might not win the election, and this might be an issue. And then after he lost the election, they raised it. That Pat Cipollone said, yes, these are presidential records. They have to be accounted for. They have to go to the archivist. This was flagged originally in May, on May 6th of 2021. I'm sorry, is it 2020? I'm getting my years screwed up. Yes. May 6th, 2021, NARA writes these Trump people and says, you're hoarding these boxes. And they make a number of efforts to try to get them back. And then finally, as it gets in late 2021, what this guy, Gary Stern, who's the lawyer for NARA, says is, look, we just want the documents back. We don't want to make a big thing out of this, but I'm going to have to escalate and report it to Congress if we don't get the documents back. And that apparently is the hammer that gets Trump to say, okay, let's try to see if we can get away with this. So even though they know there's more stuff, Trump pulls together 15 boxes of stuff and they send it to the archives, which gets it in around January of 2022. And when they get it, at least according to the press reporting, it's a mess. There's like 15 boxes. There's stuff just like thrown into the boxes. And there's no index. There's no inventory. Nothing tells you what's in there. So it's like documents and mementos and photographs, and they're all sort of thrown into these boxes. So the archives have to start going through them one by one to figure out what's in there. And what they find when they go through them one by one is that there's over 100 classified documents, 700 pages worth of classified documents, and some of them are at the highest classification level: top secret, sensitive compartmentalized information, special access programs. Obviously, other than that one Washington Post report, which suggests that some of the stuff involved nuclear weapons, the reporting can't tell us what's in the stuff, because the government shouldn't tell us what's in the stuff if it's classified, right? So, but they're assuring us that what it was the highest of the high, to the extent that Obama back in the Hillary scandal said, well, there's classified information and there's classified information. This is supposed to be the really high-level classified stuff. So when they find that, they decide we have to refer this to the Justice Department, because it's clear, number one, that they had classified information down there in a place that it wasn't supposed to be, and we have no idea, number two, that we've gotten it all back. In fact, we have reason to think we haven't gotten it all back, and he's still hoarding stuff down there. And given the condition in which the first 15 boxes came, they had no reason to believe that they had carefully segregated all the national security information out, because it was strewn in with everything else with the first bunch of stuff they got. So they refer this to the Justice Department. And the Justice Department says, according to the letter that ultimately the National Archives, the head of the National Archives who writes the letter that we're going to talk about is Deborah Seidel Wall. She's the acting archivist of the National Archives. So what she says is that when the Justice Department got this referral from NARA, they wanted the FBI to have immediate access to the boxes, to the 15 boxes that had been sent. Why didn't the FBI have immediate access to the boxes? Because they're presidential records. So under the Presidential Records Act, they're restricted access. They can't just look at them because they're Trump records. They're not Biden records. We're going to get to when they can look at them. So anyway, she says the Justice Department wanted the FBI to get immediate access to this. Why immediate access? Because whenever you realize that highly classified information has been mishandled, such that it might have been viewed by someone who wasn't entitled to see it, and worse, might have been seen by people who mean harm to the United States, they have to kind of do a damage assessment where they do a worst case scenario in their assessment to try to figure out, are there informants that we have out there who might be compromised by this? Are people vulnerable? Are they in danger? Do we have some intelligence program that we now have to fold up? If this exposed an intelligence collection method, if say the Russians or the Chinese found out that we had this super great intelligence method that we were using and that got exposed, have they been feeding us disinformation all this time and we didn't realize it? We're making, important judgments on the basis of that. So they have to get the stuff so that they can figure out what are our vulnerabilities if this information got compromised because it was mishandled. So according to the National Archives, for that reason, the Justice Department wanted the FBI to have immediate access to it. Well, maybe somebody should have told the FBI that, because they get this information probably, they're told about it in late January. And what, the media is, the media and the National Archives are clearly, trying to play this so it's not too embarrassing for the Bureau. But what they tell us, Rich, is that in February and March, the FBI conducted interviews of people at the National Archives who were dealing with the Trump people. Well, I have to say that sounds to me like they squeezed 2 days of work into 2 months. It sounds to me like, basically what happened here is they had something that was a really serious problem and they didn't do anything for 2 months. I mean, they pretty much just sat on their hands. And that's part of the argument that they didn't need to do a search warrant, because they certainly didn't act like this was an emergency situation where everybody's hair was on fire. But in any event, in April, the FBI finally says, we're now ready to examine the boxes. But under the Presidential Records Act, they can't examine the boxes unless there's 3 or 4 exceptions to the restrictions that are placed on a former president's materials. And one of them is if the current president says that access to the materials is necessary for the business of the incumbent administration, the current business of the United States. So in other words, to get the FBI access, Biden has to greenlight it. So the Justice Department asks Biden to request of the National Archives that they make the information available to the FBI. And Biden agrees to do that. So he makes the request in the National Archives. But that's not the end of it, because also under the Presidential Records Act, if that happens, the National Archivist has to notify the former president to say, we're about to give this information to the FBI. Do you have any objection to that? And lo and behold, Trump had objections. He didn't want the FBI to get access to this stuff. Now, part of the reason I think it was, not well thought through, if John Solomon was trying to help Trump here, which he clearly was, to put this reporting out, because that morning Trump had, with great fanfare, announced his lawsuit that he filed down in Florida in connection with the stuff that was seized. And in the lawsuit, even though you don't have to give an affirmative statement of facts or your version of events, Trump, of course, undertook to give one anyway. And one of the things he says again and again in this lawsuit is, I was completely cooperative with the FBI. We told them anything you need, you got it. I was totally transparent. And then Solomon puts out this letter, which shows that Trump fought tooth and nail to stop the FBI from getting access to the documents.
So why would he have opposed the FBI getting access to the documents besides just a cussed recalcitrance and just stubborn attitude that this is my stuff and why you guys messing with it?
I think that's the main reason. His knee jerk. I mean, there's a lot of hostility between Trump and the FBI, and I think Trump wants to run his campaign on that hostility. Right. That's a big part of it. So I think privately, when he deals with the FBI, he probably says, "Oh, law enforcement, I love you guys, whatever you need." But I'm sure that goes on. He's a charming guy. But his public position is the FBI is a bunch of corrupt, it's a hornet's nest. Now, the other thing is, I think he knew that there was classified information in there, and this is going to be a hot number for him. Because remember, we all know now that there was classified information in the boxes. That's not what the Narrow was telling Trump at the time. So, Trump doesn't know, maybe he knows everything that's in the boxes, and maybe he's concerned that he's going to be embarrassed by the discovery of some of the stuff that that was in there, meaning, some of the stuff that was in Mar-a-Lago that shouldn't have been. But we're talking about Trump, Rich. So it's like the usual morass of, why does he do what he does?
So a process question, Andy. So does the National Archive know? How does the National Archives know there are 15 boxes missing? Because they have a log of everything, and they're like, wait a minute, this isn't here, this isn't here. It's going to be 15 boxes, or they have a log of each box, or how would they know Trump has this stuff?
I think it's a combination of things, Rich. There's kind of a regular course of over a period of 4 years where they get stuff and they process it. So that gives them some idea of how things work. And then they also get some idea of how the president works. So they know that Trump is hoarding stuff up in the residence, and they get reports every now and then about how much stuff there is up there. I don't think when they say over 24 boxes, I don't know how scientific that is. It's probably like a ballpark guess, but they also know how presidencies work, because they manage all of the paper flow of all the presidencies. So, whether the president's directly involved or not, there's obviously a systematic thing that goes on so they can make that kind of appraisal. But I don't, how they said 24 rather than 36. I don't know. I don't, why they would say that.
And something I still wonder about is, so let's say there's the proverbial list of, of an operation of operators in the hinterlands of Pakistan who are informing us, and the president's briefed on this, and the guy from the CIA, whoever brings it over, is he really just going to leave it on the desk, or Trump's just going to say, "Oh, that's mine. I'm taking it now," and it's going to end up in the residence? Because my understanding is you bring the stuff in, and it's your responsibility to bring it out. So I don't doubt there was classified stuff floating around, and he, handled it sloppily and took it up to the residence. Like the Kim Jong-un letter, for instance. But how? I still have trouble seeing how, like, the very most sensitive, and this is what the reporting is, the very most sensitive secrets of the United States government were just floating around in the residence and got thrown into boxes and no one knew. It's, I know it was chaotic, and you've been saying this from the beginning, it was a chaotic exit, but still, I don't know how he gets his mitts on them.
Can I suggest something else though, Rich?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, understandably, we have a tendency to look at this in a vacuum because this is the problem that's in front of us. But let's say you're Pat Cipollone, right? So for the last 4, 5, 6 weeks of the administration, you're fighting with Trump every day about election fraud. And he's telling you, I should fire you. You're not doing enough. Right. We need to fire the Justice Department. We need to have an investigation of what happened in Arizona. And every time Trump comes up with one of these crazy schemes, Cipollone's the guy who has to tell him, no, that's crazy. You can't do this. And Trump erupts, because he's got other people whispering in his ears, telling him, these people who are supposed to be working for you, they're undermining you. So every inch of an ounce of Cipollone's strength is taken up with trying to fight Trump off on what they're doing with Stop the Steal. And now you're asking him into the mix. Let's also tell him let's be very careful about what classified documents you're keeping up in the. I think that when you're dealing with a personality like this, you have to pick your spots, and there's a limited amount of what people would take him on. And, if you're like the CIA briefer who comes in to give Trump a briefing and you pass out some documents, if he says he wants to hold on to this one, you're going to tell him he can't.
Right.
What you're going to do is you're going to tell Pat Cipollone as you're going out the door, I really need that back, but and tell Cipollone, hey, big guy, you're the one going to get it back from me, right? And in the meantime, Cipollone's got his own basket of problems trying to deal with this guy. So I just think with this kind of a personality, like, there's a limit to how much you can tamp down. And probably the best thing they could have done, Rich, is if they got to a point of realizing this was a problem, not to do too much show and tell. Like, if they came in to brief him, don't have documentary exhibits. Like, make it an oral briefing. He wasn't one who liked to sit and read stuff in meetings anyway. I think he did like to go back and read stuff up in the residence. But I just think he, as a personality, is a particular problem as far as this goes. And when we ask, like, how could this happen? You can't ask that without thinking about the other 16 things that were going on at the time, and factoring in the personality that you're dealing with. But that's my best answer to it. I can't. I don't know.
All right. So before we move on from this, this is speculative and it's going to be overtaken. But so, any take on what you'd expect from the affidavit for the search warrant? It would seem to me that it's going to be very inherently, right, very pro-government document. They're not going to, it's going to be sort of the maximalist case for why they need to go do this. So I don't see how it's going to benefit Trump.
No, it's not going to. Trump. I still think Trump is publicly saying he wants it. He wants the unredacted version out there, because he knows he's not going to get it. He knows the government's going to propose redactions. So he's playing a media game. Just like, he suddenly supported he didn't support having the affidavit out until the news organizations asked for it and the Justice Department opposed it. So then he jumps in, right? And remember, we were talking just last week about the fact that he had the warrant for days, and he could have publicized it, and he didn't. So I think there's the public position that he takes, and the private position that he has. He knows the Justice Department is going to move to redact this, so he figures he can do a little gotcha thing because he's saying he wants. Now he's like out there saying total transparency, but in the meantime, he knows they're going to come in. They don't want to release this, not because they're afraid that it will make them look bad. They know it'll make Trump look bad. A judge found that there was probable cause that he committed 3 crimes. It's not going to make the Justice Department look bad. What the Justice Department's worried about, I imagine, is that they may have Secret Service agents or other people who were informants who told them stuff about where the documents were, and they're worried about exposing those people before they're ready to take the case down, if they ever take the case down. I mean, Rich, from their point of view, if I'm right, if Merrick Garland really doesn't want to prosecute him for this, what they're hoping is that they can for the rest of time protect the identity of those informants. Mm-hmm. One of the real hard decisions that have to be made about whether you charge this or not is, if you charge it, you have to expose everything. Mm-hmm. And that means you'll have to give up the informants. In a normal criminal case, that, right? So you make provisions at the end of the investigation to move the informants to a place where they're going to be safe, because once you have to make discovery, then that's all going to become known. I'm not sure the Justice Department wants to do that here. I'm not sure they really want to. I don't think they want to prosecute him for this. I think they basically really wanted the documents back. So, we'll have to see. But you can bet that as far as today goes, it's going to be, I would predict, and whenever I say this, I end up wrong, right? But I'll say it anyway. I predict that today is going to be a very unedifying day, because in the first round, the Justice Department's going to suggest like complete redaction, like they'll want every comma redacted. And, Judge Reinhardt is going to see that and say, yeah, come on, there's stuff that you can disclose, because he now wants to be able to say he made them redact or unredact something, because he raised this. I think he's probably sorry. I wouldn't be surprised if he's sorry he raised this. But so I think the haggling process will begin today. And what I keep trying to remind people is that, let's say the Justice Department is unhappy with where Judge Reinhardt comes out. They're going to appeal him to the district court. So, it's not like if they, he's going to order them to do something today and they're not going to like it, but they'll just reluctantly unredact the document and make it public. They're going to go right to the district court and say, this guy's out of his mind. Don't make us do this. And then we'll have more delay while that all gets sorted out. So I'd be very surprised if anything enlightening happens today. Can I just say, Rich, that where we dropped off the chronology, there were a couple of pieces I think that are, especially given our conversation at the beginning about why this has become a harder case for people like me who thought at the beginning, especially, that this was way over the top. The Biden piece, the reason that the FBI has to get the documents, Biden has to intervene. So, to the extent John Solomon is saying, Biden got involved here, Biden got involved because the Presidential Records Act requires it. I'm sure Biden didn't want to get involved. He would rather have let this whole thing play out without his involvement. But the second thing that happens is, as soon as Trump finds out that the FBI is going to look at the documents, he starts to say, I want a delay. I want to review the documents before they review them. And the Biden administration actually accommodates him on that. They give him delays up until April 29th. And finally, on April 29th, they were originally going to give the materials to the FBI, I think, second week in April. The Biden White House counsel and the NARA people agree to put it off till April 29th. And then Trump does a classic exercise in brinksmanship. On April 29th, the day the FBI is supposed to get the stuff, he objects to the FBI getting the stuff and says, if you're not going to accommodate me with another delay, he wanted a delay without a deadline. So again, that his people could go review them and then they could discuss them with Trump. Because these are classified documents, somebody would have had to go to Washington to review them. And then Trump would have, go back to Florida and meet with Trump. So he said, if you're not going to accommodate me on this request, you should deem this to be an assertion of executive privilege to keep the documents away from the FBI. The reason that's important is once Trump asserts executive privilege under the Presidential Records Act, the archivist has to go to the president, the incumbent president, and say, what do we do with this? Do you support the former president's assertion of executive privilege? So again, this was not something that Biden went looking for. This landed in Biden's lap because of the Presidential Records Act. And he tried to pretend that he didn't make the decision. So what he ends up saying is, I'm going to defer to the archivist on this one, but I'm going to have the archivist consult with the head of the Biden administration Office of Legal Counsel, who of course, tells the archivist that Trump has no grounds here to assert executive privilege. So Biden's trying to hide the fact that he made this decision, but the only person under the statute and the only person as a matter of constitutional law who can make a decision about asserting executive privilege is the president. So Biden knows that politically it's explosive for him to get involved in this because Trump's going to make it explosive, but the statute made it unavoidable. It was only Biden who could make the call. So anyway, Biden makes the call and says, we're not going to entertain that. I don't support the assertion of executive privilege. And then they give the FBI the documents. So the day after that, May 11th, they serve a subpoena on Trump for any documents marked classified. And that leads to this June 3rd meeting where Trump actually sits with two of his lawyers and meets with the contingent of the Justice Department people and the FBI. And at that meeting, this is the meeting where Trump says, anything you want, according to Trump, just tell us, and if we've got it, you got it. But the important part of this meeting is that it was a meeting that was pursuant to a grand jury subpoena, which is a criminal investigation. If there's a grand jury subpoena, at that point, there's a criminal investigation. And they gave them a subpoena for all the classified information. The Trump lawyers, Corcoran and Evan Corcoran and Christina Bobb, give the FBI a package of documents that they say is all of the remaining classified documents. And they also give them a letter, which the government insists on, that says, we've looked through Mar-a-Lago and these are the only classified documents that are left. And according to what Christina Bobb has said publicly in the media reporting, Corcoran is the one who ran this search. I point that out, not because I have a beef with Corcoran, but only because Corcoran is currently representing Trump in the suit that they filed this week. I don't know how Corcoran's going to be able to stay in the case because he's obviously a witness in the investigation. So leaving that aside, they give the FBI the package, and a few days later, the head Justice Department lawyer on this, Jay Bratt, asked them to put a better lock on the storage facility where they think most of this stuff is. But on June 22nd, they give him another grand jury subpoena for surveillance video. Apparently at Mar-a-Lago, they have surveillance video that goes back like 60 days for various parts of the facility. So the Trump people turn over the surveillance video. And in the meantime, the FBI, according to the reporting, is now aggressively interviewing staff at Mar-a-Lago and other staff involved in Trump's post-presidency to the extent that that's organized in any way. And what we're led to believe is, according to the reporting, when they get the surveillance video, what they see is there are people breezing in and out of the places where Trump said this stuff was stored. And what they also see is people moving boxes in and out of these areas and moving documents out of boxes in and out of these areas. Now, we don't know this, Rich. This is like this is basically the government is leaking this stuff to the Times and the Washington Post. That's how we learn this. But that's what the reporting says. And it's this, I guess, cascade of events, the interviews, the surveillance video, and the fact that they had reason to believe there was other classified information that was unaccounted for that led them on August 8th to go to Judge Reinhardt and get the warrant that they executed 3 days later. So that's the chronology. And I thought it was important to lay it out just because, as I said at the beginning, I think if you think, as I do, that, executing a search warrant on former president's home should have been a last resort here, you really have to have a good explanation for what they should have done short of that. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a good answer to that question right now.
So let's go to the Bill Barr memo about what constitutes obstruction. This generated a few headlines, got buried by the cascade of other cascading events with other news stories. But what there's a lot of focus on this at the time. What do you make of it?
Well, it's not at all. When you read it, Rich, it's no surprise. I mean, anybody who heard our discussions and read some of the stuff, not only from me, but that other people were writing on our site back in 2018, 2019, none of this would surprise anyone, which leads me to believe the reason the Justice Department, including the Biden Justice Department, didn't want this out had nothing to do with that they were concerned about something that was in it that would be embarrassing somehow to the Justice Department. I think they simply didn't want to have a precedent that they have to make public their rationale for not charging people, because that would put them afoul of the longstanding Justice Department guidance that the Justice Department doesn't speak publicly about people that it doesn't charge. So I think it's an institutional objection. I don't think it was I don't think it was based on anything besides that. So there's that. And then I think as a legal matter, there's nothing surprising at all in this memorandum. It lays out why the Justice Department decided, and when I say the Justice Department, we're now talking about Bill Barr, who was the Attorney General at the time, the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, and then the two guys who are actually authors of the memo that is endorsed by Barr are Stephen Engel, who is the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, and Ed O'Callahan, who was the top aide to Rosenstein, which is important because Rosenstein, if you recall, was basically the nominal supervisor of the Mueller investigation because Jeff Sessions was recused, and Rosenstein is the one who appointed Mueller in the first place. So just to basically the memo has two parts. One of it is an explanation for why the Justice Department decided that it had to make this decision. And this was a big bone of contention at the time. When Mueller got appointed, we should recall, by then it was very clear to the Justice Department, even though they weren't saying this publicly, that there was no Russia collusion case. We know that they know that there was no Russia collusion case against Trump at that point. So at the time Mueller was appointed, really, this was the period after the firing of James Comey. And at that point, the FBI was carrying this investigation as a criminal investigation of Trump for potential obstruction of justice. And that was basically a decision that was made by Andrew McCabe, who became the acting FBI director when Comey was fired. So in essence, the only decision, arguably, that it was necessary to have a special counsel to make was whether there was an obstruction case against Trump or not. So that was really the only decision that you really needed from Mueller, and it was the one decision that he wouldn't make. And what, if you remember, he had a very weaselly rationale for why he wouldn't make the decision. He basically said that because it's Justice Department guidance that presidents can't be indicted, it wouldn't be fair to President Trump to make a recommendation one way or the other on that, because if we decided that he could be charged, then he wouldn't be able to have a public proceeding in court where he could defend himself. That was very precious concern about fairness to President Trump, and it might have been more convincing if at the time that they were saying that, they weren't also releasing 400 pages of evidence that actually cast Trump in a very poor light, including 200 pages of obstruction evidence. So it wasn't they didn't have a very convincing reason for not making the decision. And as the Justice Department points out in the letter that written by Engel, and the memo to Barr, which Barr endorses, written by Engel and O'Callaghan, what they point out is, look, in every case, the Justice Department either charges or it doesn't charge. And if you say publicly, we're not saying that we're not charging, but we're not charging either, then what people are going to assume is that you think there's a case, but you're just not saying it. So that's just as prejudicial. So somebody has to decide this. And because Mueller didn't step up to the plate and decide it, we're going to decide it. And they say that they think it's an easy call that there's no case against Trump. They point out that they disagree with Mueller's very extravagant take on obstruction. And here I think it's interesting. The memo repeatedly cites to the Arthur Anderson case, where the Supreme Court on a 9-0 decision threw out a conviction that was won by none other than Andrew Weissman, who was the top deputy to Mueller on this case, who had this very extravagant theory that an allegedly corrupt motive to do something that was lawful would amount to obstruction of justice. What the Justice Department says here is we're not going to hash out that argument that we have with that interpretation of obstruction, because it's not necessary here to find that President Trump didn't violate the law. And what they say is, look, in an obstruction case, you basically have two elements. You have the act that is said to be obstructive, and then you have the underlying thing that it's trying to obstruct, the thing that it's trying to cover up. And if you look at all the Justice Department's cases, what we have is the act that is committed to obstruct something is clearly criminal, like tampering with a witness or tampering with a document, something that's clearly a criminal act. And then in other situations where you have an act that may or may not be criminal, but you think it's done with a bad purpose, the underlying thing that is being covered up is clearly a crime. So a drug conspiracy or a gambling conspiracy or something that's clearly criminal. So they say that even though we have cases that say, an innocent act can be obstruction under some circumstances, if you look hard at our cases, none of them are about that. They're always either a criminal act or an underlying criminal conspiracy that they're trying to cover up. And here, what they mainly find is that even Mueller found in his first 200 pages of his report that there was no criminal conspiracy that tied Trump to Russia. And therefore, Trump's intention here has to be, when we're trying to interpret what it was, we have to take into account that Trump believed the investigation was unjust, that it was a political witch hunt, and that it was undertaken with the objective of trying to take him off his governing agenda that he ran on. So even though he did a lot of things that that make you go, you have to prove corrupt intent beyond a reasonable doubt. And they just said, on these facts, even if we accepted Mueller's interpretation of what you have to prove obstruction, you still wouldn't have an obstruction case.
So let's also hit the debt forgiveness, student loan debt forgiveness from Biden unilaterally. Of course, Nancy Pelosi a year ago or so was saying there's no way a president could do this on his own. He has no such authority. You had a memo from the general counsel of Trump's education department saying the same thing on the way out the door. And I believe also Obama's education department general counsel in his private capacity came to the same conclusion. And lo and behold, they've actually found such authority, supposedly in something called the HEROES Act, passed in 2003, having with the purpose to make sure that in the post-September 11th environment, you're an active duty military being deployed overseas, you're being held harmless in terms of your student debt obligations, and they're interpreting this to be a warrant for a sweeping population-wide debt forgiveness.
Yeah, because it's supposed to be applying to conditions of wartime or other catastrophes, and they're saying that COVID was a catastrophe, which is laughable because they've been pushing for this for a long time, right before we had COVID. And I think the interesting thing here, Rich, is, by the way, I want to formally subscribe myself to the Charlie Cook jihad against this. I mean, if you want to see the best stuff that's been argued against this thing, Charlie's been on fire on that stuff, and I think he's completely right that this is, as a matter of law, this is laughable. That's not to say they won't get away with it, but it's laughable. During the Obama years, they gave not debt forgiveness, but changing the terms of student loans in a way that would effectively end up canceling out some of them by fiddling around with the terms and saying that capping how much you could be forced to pay based on what your disposable income was month to month. They had these formulas, and they all did this under something that was called the income-based repayment plan in federal law. That was the three times that Obama did this over the years, and that's based on a congressional statute along with stuff that's the regulations that are in the Code of Federal Regulations for these income-based repayment plans. And I have to say, I was very surprised to read the memo rationalizing this yesterday, because the smart money on this was that if Biden did something, it would be to further push on the joints that Obama had worked in connection with these income-based repayment plans. And it seemed that was the way he was going to go. So instead, he goes in this other direction based on the HEROES Act, saying that COVID is the kind of catastrophe that they're talking about here, and that's supposed to pass the laugh test. And I suspect the reason they didn't go based on the income-based repayment plan is because, number one, Obama didn't use it to cancel debt. Pelosi, as you just said, expressly said that it was an authority for the president to cancel debt. She said that, there has to be a congressional statute. And there's a lot of good reason for them to think they needed a congressional statute on the existing law as it stood when Biden entered office. So I guess he figured he had to come up with a different rationale than one that had been pursued in the past. And this is the one they came up with. Here's the problem with challenging it. You would think that you could challenge it in the courts and you'd have a pretty good argument against it, particularly after the Supreme Court has really endorsed at the end of its term this idea of the major question doctrine, which essentially holds that if the executive branch or an administrative agency is going to take some action that marks a sweeping change in our understanding of how government works, the relationship between a person and the state, people's obligations, et cetera. If they're going to work a major change, they have to be able to show an unambiguous congressional statute that actually confers that authority. So you would think that this would be a classic case of trying to invoke that to say Congress never signed off on this, which is why people like the Speaker of the House say that you need a statute, because there's nothing in existing law that would allow you to do that. The problem with challenging it in court is going to be standing. Who has standing to bring this suit? Because basically the standing rules exist so that we don't have major government policies being decided by the court. So if your objection to this is that it's illegal, but you're not someone who's being like personally harmed by it, you're just like an American who's being harmed by it, like the rest of us are being harmed by it. Like, I paid my student loans. How come I'm not getting a refund, but these people are getting theirs canceled? That's not going to be a basis to get into court. So to file a lawsuit, you have to show that you have been personally, concretely harmed by this. So I think it's going to be tough to get past standing, although, Chief Justice Roberts is a stickler for standing. But I bet you that there are conservative justices on the court who want to figure out a way to hear this case. I would assume, because this looks like it's, basically illegal. So that's the problem in court is going to be standing. And the problem on the legislative side is, you have the Congressional Review Act. Let's assume that this plays out. The Education Department's going to promulgate these regulations, and it'll take a few months, but finally they'll have a regulation that's on the books. And then let's say the Republicans win both the Senate and the House in the next election. Well, you can't filibuster Congressional Review Act, so they could pass a law, or they could pass a resolution that rejects the regulation. The problem is it's legislation, so Biden would have to sign it, and Biden would veto it, and they don't have the votes, obviously, to even if they win the Senate and the House, they're not going to have the votes to override a veto. And then if you look further out the horizon, let's say in 2024 a Republican wins the presidency and the Republicans still maintain control of the House and the Senate. By that point, the Congressional Review Act window is gone, which means you'd have to overrule this by regular legislation, which means you would need enough votes in the Senate to get past a filibuster there. So I think Biden's calculation here is we just need something that passes the laugh test. I'm not sure this does, by the way, but you just need something that we can, like a fig leaf that gets us, to 2024. They're going to have to hold their breath to see what happens in the courts. And I'm sure people are thinking up creative. If you have a creative idea for standing, call 1-800-CHARLIE-COOK. And he's taking all your suggestions, and we'll come up with a good lawsuit. But there'll be a lot of creative standing ideas, and I think the best chance of beating this would be in court. It's going to be a tough row to hoe legislatively.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Andy McCarthy.
Thanks, Rich.